In 1977, the great American physician and psychiatrist George Engel called for a biopsychosocial approach, which recognizes that biology is inseparable from our psychological dynamics and social relationships. So,
Not new.
so that this is nothing new. Now, what is new is that these great pioneers, what they recognized intuitively, now we have proven by means of hard science. So in terms of hard science, the body and the mind can't be separated.
No.
That the emotional centers in the brain are connected with the nervous system, with the hormonal apparatus, with the immune system, with the gut, and with the heart. In other words, they're not even connected, because even to say connected creates the impression that separate entities are somehow wired together. These are not separate. They're one system.
Yeah, one system.
They're just as Candace Pert called it, the body-mind. It's one system. Therefore, it just stands to reason that whatever happens emotionally will have its manifestation physiologically. And sure enough, when people get emotionally stressed, that's not just a psychological event. Their hormonal apparatus goes into gear. They secrete stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. Now here's an interesting little fact. When you go to a dermatologist for inflammation of the skin, or a rheumatologist, inflammation of the joints, or a neurologist for inflammation of the intestines, or a respirologist for inflammation of your lungs, and I could go on, what medicine are you going to get? You're going to get some analog of cortisol, which is the stress hormone. Now you think as physicians we might ask ourselves, gosh, we're treating everything with stress hormones. Could stress have something to do with the onset of these conditions? Maybe just, perhaps.
Yeah.
And of course, the research is indubitable that that's actually the case.
Yeah.
And the physiological pathways have to do with these connections. That what happens emotionally affects the immune system. That what happens, or what happens in the immune system can actually affect the emotions.
Yeah.
So if you get a viral infection, that can release hormones from the white blood cells that will make you depressed.
Yeah, when I had COVID, I was so depressed, and I'm never really depressed like that. And I was like, I understand why people want to kill themselves.
Yeah. So
I knew it was COVID, but I was like, holy cow.
Yeah. So it goes both ways. So it's not just the physiology. So because it's one unit and it's one system, it's inevitable that whatever happens emotionally, it's going to show up physiologically. Furthermore, we know that childhood trauma elevates the circulation of inflammatory particles in the blood, cytokines so-called, which can turn on cancer genes, which can reduce the body's defenses, which can support the growth of blood vessels to support tumors, so on. We know that stress, even in utero, if your mother experiences stress, that'll show up in your physiology at age 45.
Yeah.
By mechanisms I write about in the book, but I won't go into now. But in other words, it's just this constant dance between our psychological lives and our physiology, and it's unscientific to ignore it. And I've only mentioned a few mechanisms. Then there's the impact of stress and emotions on the functioning of our genes, which is studied by epigenetics. Just listen to people's stories. Let them tell you about their lives. That's evidence.
Exactly. Absolutely.
It's only not evidence to the people who are terminally cut off from their heart,
And what's really striking to me, and there's some interesting literature on the Holocaust, which you were in many ways sort of a representative of the trauma from that generation, is that generational trauma is real. It's not just an abstract idea, but the biblical idea that the sins of the fathers are visited upon their sons. I mean, there's actually scientific evidence now that we know how our imprinting in our grandparents or their grandparents is transmitted generationally through these little tags or bookmarks on our genes that determine what happens to us.
So experiences in life can change how genes are turned on and off by the environment. And those effects can be transmitted into new generations without any change in genetic structure.
Yeah.
And there's this tremendous misbelief in the power of genes in the general public and certainly in the medical profession. there are very few genetic diseases.
Yeah.
There's very few genetic diseases that if you have the gene, you're going to get a disease. Well, genes themselves, even in the case of breast cancer, like Angelina Jolie very famously had mastectomies and oophorectomies. Their ovaries were taken out, and she did made a calculated decision because an aggressive form of that gene runs in her family, and so I understand that, but that's very rare, comparatively speaking. And so most illnesses, the genetic effect, if any, is minimal and not at all decisive. And what is decisive is how the environment acts.
Yeah, it's true. And I think, historically, illness was seen as a spiritual problem.
Yeah.
In most cultures. You mentioned Lakota, when someone's sick, they bring the community together.
Yeah.
And the shamans and the medicine men were the healers. And there was no division between, spirituality and disease and health. It was all one continuum. And I spent, a lot of time in very interesting cultures when I was in medical school. One was a Hopi reservation, and another was in Nepal. And there was this embedded culture of shamanism and medicine men and healers. And I remember being up in mountains and way in the remote areas near Tibet in Nepal. We were in a medical expedition, and the Dami Jankris were the Nepalese healers, and there was this incredible ceremony with the whole community around. And the ill person, it wasn't like you went to the doctor and you went and sat in an office by yourself. Like the whole community was there.
That's right.
And the healer was there working on the person, and they were doing whatever they were doing, but activating different healing mechanisms of the body that we actually can activate through these various different modalities. And many cultures historically have used medicines, plant medicines, to actually heal. And now with the advent of this field of psychedelic assisted therapy, this whole conversation is changing. These are all technologies, let's call them ancient technologies, some more modern technologies that actually seem to help people sort of take a quantum jump over and leapfrog over a lot of the sort of slogging through the traumas through traditional therapy and traditional psychiatry and medication, which often doesn't really work that well.
Well, I wonder if you had, like myself, often wished or not often wished that if we could just combine the amazing achievements of modern medicine with some humility to look at the traditional wisdoms, teachings of indigenous peoples, because it's not a question of one over the other, but boy, if we had that kind of wisdom infused into our technological minds, we would be so much more powerful as healers. And as you suggested, the illness is not just as a biological event, but as a psychological, spiritual event. So the medicine wheel of North American indigenous people, which the four quadrants of mind and spirit and body and sociality all have to be balanced. And some traditions, like for example with ayahuasca, it wasn't necessarily the client who would take the plant, but the shaman would. And the shaman would then get a vision and deep insight. And I've worked with these indigenous shamans in the Peruvian rainforest. Let me tell you, they're penetrating.
The Shibobo healers.
Yeah, the Shibobo healers, they're deep. And they see things that Western medicine just hasn't got a clue about. I'm talking personally, I had that experience.
Yeah, can you share that?
Yeah, and they just saw right into me. They had no idea who I was. They were not impressed.
They had read all your books?
They didn't read my books. They were not impressed with my credentials. They just saw this human being carrying a lot of trauma. And they just saw it. And they worked with it. So, and I didn't have to be on the plant for them to see that. I was, but it was their own vision that allowed them to see that. So that's the first point. Is that partly it has to do with who's administering it and what context and what training they've had. Secondly, Sigmund Freud once said that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, meaning that in dreams you manifest some of our most unconscious emotional dynamics, which is true, but the interpretation of dreams is notoriously difficult, and I think Freud certainly had his own delusions when it came to interpreting other people's dreams. But I think psychedelics might be said to be a royal road to the unconscious, because they remove the usual defenses of the egoic mind. So you get to see both the pain and the possibility that underlies the egoic mindset. So people get in touch with some deep agony sometimes. They also get in touch with some beauty that they had not been in touch with, but it's been inside them all along. So you get to see both the traumatized, unprotected, uncovered, traumatized aspect of your personality that's been pulling the strings behind the curtains for a long time now. But you also get to see the possibilities of oneness and unity and love and beauty, so that you don't have to keep running, you don't have to keep employing these defenses. That's it in a very small nutshell, but the potential is tremendous, and I've seen it happen. I've experienced some of it myself, and I've certainly seen it happen a lot in my work with other people.